One quiet afternoon in mid-October, as the last golden threads of autumn light spilled across the brick steps outside, Agnes McConnell, 73 years old, sat motionless in her worn-down living room. The lace curtains fluttered gently in the breeze, and the wall clock kept ticking, unaware that today was the day everything would change. In her trembling hand, a small black device sat quietly. Not a TV remote, but the controller for the hidden cameras she had discreetly installed throughout her home. Something her children never suspected. After all, in their eyes, she was just the forgetful old lady. 2 weeks earlier, her youngest son Mark and his wife Nicole had suddenly become unusually kind. They dropped by more often, bringing warm coffee, pastries, and an endless stream of sugary concern. Their voices were soft, their questions polite. They asked about her health, they lingered longer, and slowly, the topic of reorganizing some home documents for convenience entered the conversation. Agnes listened, nodded gently, smiled politely. But what they didn't see in her eyes was clarity. Cold, unwavering clarity. She wasn't perfect, but she had once run her own small business for 30 years. She was a widow who raised 3 children alone after her husband died suddenly at 42. She handled her taxes each year without help. She knew the difference between a genuine helping hand and a scheme wrapped in sweet words, and this felt off. One crisp morning, Nicole placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Agnes. "Just sign here, Mom," she said sweetly. "It's just temporary power of attorney so we can handle all the paperwork stuff for you. Things are getting complicated these days." Agnes nodded. But the moment they left, she reached into her bathrobe pocket, pulled out a tiny USB drive, and plugged it into her laptop. She reviewed the footage from the camera hidden beneath the bookshelf. Everything had been recorded, their voices, their glances, and that moment when Nicole smirked and whispered to Mark, "She couldn't remember lunch yesterday. You think she's gonna remember signing this?" Welcome to Sarah Stories, where tales that seem too twisted to be true often are, especially for the millions of older adults out there dismissed, underestimated, and sometimes betrayed by those they once trusted most. But this time, they picked the wrong woman. Agnes didn't sign. She documented, she backed up her recordings. She sent copies to a longtime friend who worked in estate law. And she prepared, not for revenge but for justice. For the respect that should never have been in question. They thought she was losing her mind. But she recorded everything. If you've ever witnessed, heard of, or even felt the weight of unfairness like this, please subscribe to Sarah Stories. Your support helps us keep telling powerful, emotional, and true stories like Agnes's. Because everyone deserves to be heard, no matter their age. And now, a question for you, especially if you've made it this far into the story. If someone close to you asked you to sign a vaguely worded document, saying it was just to help manage things, would you A, sign it immediately out of trust, B, ask for details and seek a third-party review? Leave your answer in the comments, A or B, and feel free to share if you've ever been in a similar situation. We read every comment and your story matters. Helen Morris, 74, lived at the end of a tree-lined road in a quiet corner of Oregon. Her home, an old white wooden house with a gray shingle roof, wasn't just a place to live. It was a living monument to a life fully lived, a life of love, of building, of fiercely holding on. Helen was never one to boast. She had a quiet grace about her, the kind that lingered like the scent of old books or fresh tea in the afternoon sun. In her living room hung a black and white wedding photo, faded but proud, a younger Helen and her husband Robert, standing side by side on their wedding day, nearly 5 decades ago. Robert had been a carpenter, once a firefighter before an early retirement due to health issues. Helen, a lifelong librarian, found joy in poetry and stillness. They were never wealthy, but they had something money could never buy, a home they built with sweat, patience, and love. That house began as a tiny forest cabin, with Robert handcrafting every door, every shelf. Helen planted roses along the porch. As the years passed, the home grew, a new room added when their son Tom was born, a walnut reading desk crafted by Robert when Helen was promoted to head librarian. And after Robert died, it was in that same living room that Helen placed his portrait, where she sat each morning with a cup of tea, facing the empty chair he used to occupy. Tom had once been her greatest pride, a bright-eyed boy who once said he wanted to become an engineer and build homes for the poor. Helen and Robert gave up vacations, skipped new cars, and saved every dollar to put him through college out of state. On the day of his graduation, Helen wept with joy. She believed she had done everything a mother possibly could. But life rarely follows a straight line. After getting married, Tom's calls grew sparse. Miranda, Helen's daughter-in-law, was sharp, successful in real estate, polished, always composed. Helen had tried to build a connection. She invited them for dinners, gifted small tokens, and shared old family stories. But Miranda remained distant, polite but cold, kind but never warm. Then one day, Tom and Miranda sat her down. Mom, Tom began, this house is too big for you alone. Miranda and I need more space for the baby. You should come live with us, it'll be easier for everyone. Helen said nothing. She simply turned her gaze to the garden, where Robert's rose bushes still bloomed crimson against the white fence. Something inside her tightened. It wasn't just the idea of change. It was the quiet whisper of intuition. This wasn't a request. It was a warning. In the weeks that followed, Miranda began visiting more often. She brought folders filled with documents, power of attorney forms, and legal jargon Helen was expected to accept without question. But Helen wasn't naive. She had spent decades in a library. She recognized predatory language hidden in fine print. She understood exactly what they were after, not just the house, but ownership, control, and the ability to shut her out the moment she became inconvenient. But Helen Morris wasn't someone to be handled easily. She remembered what Robert once told her, never sign anything without reading it. And never give away something you've spent your life building to someone who doesn't respect it. So Helen started watching more closely. She hid her important documents. She bought a discreet camera and tucked it beneath the bookshelf. She taught herself how to back up footage, how to send encrypted emails, how to store originals on a USB drive. All the skills Miranda laughed off as too complicated for old woman losing her memory. But Helen knew this wasn't a battle of tears or raised voices. It was a battle of memory, of awareness, of a mother standing as the last defense between family and the exploitation of trust. And she was ready, not to retaliate, but to protect, not just the house but something far more sacred, the value of a life spent loving, giving, and now being dismissed. Because sometimes when the world sees you as weak, that's precisely when you're strongest. And Helen Morris, silver-haired, steady-eyed, was living proof of that. I can also help craft the next scene, or adapt this into a full video script with voiceover pacing and image prompts. The first warning didn't come in the form of a loud confrontation. It arrived quietly, in a cooling cup of tea left untouched on a wooden table. Helen sat there across from Tom and Miranda, her fingers brushing the edge of the file they had just handed her. She tried to maintain a polite smile, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Miranda, dressed in her usual sharp business attire with her hair pinned tightly back, smiled sweetly, her voice as smooth as honey. It's just a restructure of ownership, Mom. Just paperwork. You still get to live here. Nothing's being taken away. Tom, sitting beside her, nodded in agreement. Yeah, Mom, I know you hate paperwork and legalese, but this just makes things easier if there's ever a need for repairs or insurance. It's just to simplify everything. Helen gave a slight nod but kept her eyes on the document. The pages were filled with dense, fine-print legal language, terms that even she, a woman who'd spent her entire life working in a library, needed a few minutes to decipher. Something didn't sit right. There was a vague feeling, quiet but firm, echoing in her gut, like a bell tolling in the middle of the night. She had read enough novels, heard enough real, life stories from friends to know one thing: the clever ones don't steal by shouting. They do it with calm voices, kind gestures, and carefully chosen words. She lifted her teacup and took a slow sip. Bitter, not from the tea, but from the undercurrent of what was happening at that kitchen table. The same table where she and Robert once mapped out their dreams for their son's future. The pine-paneled kitchen glowed under a shaft of late sunlight. A faint lavender scent lingered near the cabinet. And yet, everything felt foreign, like the house was quietly slipping through her fingers, not through force, but through calculated kindness. You just need to sign right here, Miranda said, her manicured red nail gliding across a line labeled, Transfer of Ownership into Joint Legal Control with Secondary Signatory Possessing Executive Authority. Helen furrowed her brow. Who's the secondary signatory? Tom answered quickly, not bothering to look up. That'd be me. You're the primary, Mom, I'm the secondary. You'll still live here, nothing changes. It's just, in case something happens we can step in. Didn't you always say better safe than sorry? Helen didn't respond right away. She looked at her son, the same boy she used to walk hand in hand through Portland's rainy streets, the boy who once jumped for joy at his college acceptance letter, the boy who had once written home, Mom, I miss your breakfasts. Now he was leaning toward her, his eyes no longer full of youthful light, not exactly deceitful. But not the same. Tom, she said softly. You think I should sign this without asking any questions? The question hung in the air like a suspended breath. Miranda let out a short laugh. Mom, if you don't trust us, I can call a lawyer to explain it. But there's no need to worry. We just want to make sure everything's secure. No one's trying to kick you out. Helen nodded again. She had learned that silence was sometimes the most powerful position. Now wasn't the time to argue. It was the time to listen, to observe. But deep inside, a quiet monologue stirred. Can I trust this? This is my son, my family. And yet, she remembered something Robert once wrote in a letter during a business trip, still folded neatly in her nightstand drawer. Helen, trust is a costly gift. Don't give it away too easily, not even to the ones who once held your hand. Helen didn't sign. She told them she wanted to review it more thoroughly. Miranda masked her disappointment with a smile. Tom looked annoyed, but replied, "It's up to you, Mom. I just want what's best." After they left, Helen remained at the table. The sunlight had faded. She turned on the lamp, reached for her reading glasses, and spread the papers out. One by one, she read each line, each clause, each faint footnote printed in gray. The language grew more telling the deeper she read. Temporary authority, transfer without first-party consent, executive rights in case of incapacity. This wasn't simplification. This was the groundwork for a quiet takeover. Helen rose from the table and walked slowly to her bookshelf. She opened a worn leather notebook. Inside were months' worth of notes. Dates, phrases Miranda had said, changes in behavior, and phone calls where Tom had started suggesting let us handle the paperwork. She had written it all down. They didn't think a 74-year-old woman could be a detective, but they'd forgotten. A woman who spent her life curating thousands of books could easily preserve a few pieces of evidence. That night, Helen made a decision. One more step was needed, a step to protect this home, not for the bricks or beams, not for the monetary value, but for something far more sacred, the final shred of respect she owed herself, and to the man who once promised, standing before her and God, "No one takes this home while you're still alive." Helen was still alive, and she wouldn't sign a single thing until she was sure she wasn't being betrayed. The first sign didn't come in the form of shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, on a gentle sunny morning. Helen woke up, slipped on her knit sweater, and headed toward the back door, holding her old watering can, just as she had done for over 40 years. Her garden wasn't just a patch of soil and blooms. It was her sanctuary, a place where she spoke to the past, to her husband, and sometimes, just to herself. But as her hand reached for the doorknob, Tom's voice rang out from the living room, flat, casual, almost rehearsed. "Mom, I locked the back door. Please don't go out into the garden. The weeds and dirt aren't good for you." Helen turned, quietly watching her son hunched over his laptop, eyes fixed on the screen. He didn't even look up. His voice was too normal, too practiced. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a caring reminder, but to Helen, it felt like a silent push, away from one of the last pieces of her life she still had control over. She didn't respond. She just placed the watering can on the table and walked slowly back to her room. A few days later, another small but strange shift occurred. Helen couldn't connect to the Wi-Fi to video call her old friend in Seattle, like she usually did every week. After several failed attempts, she walked out to ask Miranda, who was working at the dining table, fingers flying across her keyboard. Without even glancing up, Miranda replied, voice soft but sharp as glass, "I changed the password. We need to keep the network secure for my work. You don't really need the internet, right?" Helen froze, not because of the answer, but because of what it revealed. You don't need it. That was how they were starting to see her, not someone who needed to be informed, connected, or even involved. Just someone irrelevant, outdated, in the way. Things were changing faster now. Helen began to feel like a guest in the very home she and her late husband had built with their own hands. Each time Tom brought her a cup of tea, his eyes carried more pity than warmth. Every time Miranda asked, "Have you taken your medicine yet?" it sounded less like care and more like surveillance. One afternoon, while passing the home office, Helen heard the printer whirring. She rarely interfered with their things, but something, intuition maybe, nudged her forward. She stepped in, and on the tray was a still warm document. She picked it up. Her heart sank. Bold letters at the top read, "Quitclaim deed." Helen knew exactly what it meant. A quitclaim deed is a legal document that transfers ownership of property with no promises, no guarantees. Once signed, the house would no longer be hers. No right to stay, no safety net. Just a clean handoff. A signature, and everything she had would be gone. She placed her hand over her chest, where her heartbeat thudded slow and heavy, like a stone had been placed on her memories. This wasn't just a house, it was her life with Robert. From the first floorboard to the white picket fence, even the creaky porch swing he fixed every spring. And now someone had written a few lines of legal jargon to erase it all, because they thought she was too old to understand. But the worst part wasn't the document. It was the fact that they hadn't even shown it to her. They printed it in secret, hid it, prepared a plan. And she wasn't part of that plan, as a person with a voice, but as an obstacle to be removed. Helen didn't feel angry, not in the way she once would have. Instead, she felt hollow, like someone had ripped out the oldest tree in her garden without even saying goodbye. She returned to her room, closed the door, and sat quietly on the edge of her bed. There were no tears, those had dried up long ago, back when Tom stopped calling her mommy and switched to mom with a tone of annoyance. When Miranda moved in and started clearing away things she called clutter, which included Robert's old love letters, Helen opened her notebook, the one she'd started writing in the moment her gut told her something was wrong. She flipped to a fresh page and jotted, Oct 1/12 of Tom said I shouldn't go out to the garden. Miranda changed the Wi-Fi password. Printer produced quitclaim deed. They're planning a transfer of ownership. They think I'm confused, I'm not. She closed the notebook and exhaled deeply. Then, almost instinctively, Helen walked over to her dresser and pulled out a small voice recorder, the one she sometimes used to log her thoughts on lonely nights. She held it for a long moment, staring at the smooth, familiar shape in her palm. And then, softly, she whispered to herself, if they think I don't know, maybe it's time they find out I've been watching all along. Under the dim yellow glow of the bedside lamp, Helen sat in silence, her fingers gently flipping through the pages of her journal. What began as scattered notes over several days had now formed a painful summary. Every small gesture, every subtle shift in daily habits, every seemingly harmless remark from Tom or Miranda, all of it painted a picture she could no longer deny. They were trying to take the house, quietly, methodically, coldly. She wasn't angry. Helen had never been someone who lost control out of rage. In her 74 years of life, she had learned that people rarely say their intentions out loud, but they always leave traces behind, and often in silence. The truth reveals itself louder than any defense, but this time she knew watching and sensing wasn't enough. She needed evidence, not to seek revenge, but to survive. Not to win, but to protect herself before they erased her from the very place she had built with her own 2 hands. That night, when the house went dark, Helen quietly opened the old coat closet in the corner of her room. Hidden between wool scarves and a worn sewing kit was a small velvet-wrapped bundle. Inside were 2 tiny security cameras, a gift she'd received years ago during her time on a local retirees advisory board. She hadn't expected to use them, but she had kept them, just in case. And tonight, just in case, had finally arrived. Without making a sound, Helen tiptoed to the living room. She placed one camera behind the tall potted plant next to the bookshelf, a perfect vantage point to capture every conversation that took place between Tom and Miranda. The second camera she carefully mounted beneath Miranda's desk, right where Helen had discovered the printed quitclaim deed. Both devices had internal memory, capable of recording continuously for 48 hours before looping, and with a backup USB she could extract footage whenever she needed. The next morning, Helen woke early and made tea like she always did. She wore her favorite gray silk robe, soft and modest, but today, hidden in the chest pocket, was something new. A small digital voice recorder, nearly weightless and completely silent. She turned it on before leaving her room. She didn't know what today might capture, but she believed that the truth always found its way to the surface, as long as you had the patience to listen. Over breakfast, Miranda spoke of simplifying the paperwork in a tone so breezy it could have been mistaken for a chat about curtain colors. Tom sat beside her, nodding along, sighing about Oregon property taxes. Neither of them looked Helen in the eye. They talked around her, as if she were a decorative relic, present but irrelevant. Helen listened. Her hand rested gently on her teacup as her eyes gazed out the window, where the light filtered through the cherry blossom tree her late husband planted the year they moved in. She nodded when needed, smiled when addressed, and occasionally drifted into silence, letting them believe it was just old age. But in truth, her mind was sharper than ever. Every word, every glance, every suspicious agreement was being recorded, both by the device in her pocket and by the memory of a former literature teacher who had once graded essays with clinical precision. 4 days later, Helen reviewed her first batch of audio. She sat by the window, headphones on, listening intently. Miranda's voicey. She doesn't need to understand it all. We just need the signature. The lawyer will take care of the rest. Tom replied. She won't even notice. She couldn't remember the Wi-Fi password last week. Then they both laughed. It was a soft laugh but sharp, like a razor blade in the dark. No hesitation, no empathy. Just 2 adults calculating, and Helen, the woman who had given them everything, was now just an asset to be transferred. Helen turned off the recorder and sat still, no tears. Not anymore. Her well had run dry the day Tom stopped calling her Mama and switched to Mom with a sigh. The day Miranda began throwing out things she labeled unnecessary, like Robert's old love letters. She pulled out a small sheet of paper, scribbled a few lines, and sealed it in an envelope. On the front she wrote, "In case of emergency, send to local paper." She tucked it into the second drawer of her vanity. hidden but ready. That afternoon, once Tom had left for work and Miranda went out shopping, Helen stood in the middle of the living room, looking up at the ceiling. She knew she didn't have much time. Sooner or later, they would make their move. But now she had something they never imagined she'd possess: evidence. And nothing is more dangerous than a woman they believe to be fragile and forgetful, who was silently collecting the truth, piece by piece, like clouds gathering before a storm. She whispered to herself, as if speaking to the ghosts of her past, "Not every battle needs a gun. Some only need a record button, and I'm ready." In the fading light of late afternoon, Helen sat quietly at the small table tucked in the corner of her room, the same place she once used to knit or handwrite letters. But today, her needles lay untouched. No letters were being written. In front of her sat a sleek black digital recorder, the very one she had hidden in her bathrobe pocket for weeks. Her fingers moved slowly, yet deliberately, as she pressed play. The sound emerged, muffled and slightly distorted, as if echoing from a world she no longer recognized as her own. "As soon as she signs, we'll sell the house and move to Arizona." It was Miranda's voice. Clear. Not a hint of hesitation. A single sentence, brief and blunt, but heavier than any verdict Helen had ever heard. Miranda had no idea that every breath, every word, every pause was being recorded, not by some fancy piece of technology, but by the heart of a woman who had once loved them like her own flesh and blood. Then came Tom's voice, soft and shameless. "She's old and confused. No one's gonna believe her anyway." Helen stopped the playback. Her eyes didn't blink. She had prepared herself for the worst. She knew Tom was no longer the boy with rosy cheeks and a hopeful gaze. But she never imagined her son, the same child who once sobbed in her arms after breaking his arm at age 8, could sound so cold. That line wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a declaration, a confirmation that, "My mother is now a burden, a legal obstacle, a problem that needs to be solved." Suddenly, decades of motherhood flashed before Helen's eyes. The sleepless nights tending to Tom's fevers, the end-of-month dinners that consisted of eggs and toast, dressed up as feasts, so he wouldn't feel poor. The countless times she washed his baseball uniform by hand in cold water, because the washer was broken and they couldn't afford a new one. She used to believe that if nothing else, those memories would live on somewhere in Tom's heart. But now, with one weightless sentence, she realized to her son, a mother's love held no legal or emotional value anymore. She was just a signature required to legitimize the sale of the very home she and her late husband had spent over 40 years building. There were no tears. Helen had lived through too many seasons of mourning to know that tears were no longer the proper vessel for this kind of grief. Instead, she closed her eyes. One question echoed quietly in her mind: why? Not why would they do this, because she already understood the motives. But why does family love run dry so fast? How does a mother, who gave her child milk, warmth, and sacrifice, end up being treated like a disposable asset? Helen played the recording again, not for confirmation, but to remember, to transform that hurt into resolve, to remind herself that now was not the time for softness, not out of vengeance but out of justice. She needed to act, not just for herself, but for every mother, every father, every grandparent quietly enduring the silent betrayal of children raised with love, yet blinded by greed. She rose, recorder in hand. Her steps were slow but firm as she made her way to the bedroom, to the old wooden box where she kept her important documents. She opened it and pulled out a piece of paper with a phone number scribbled on it, a local journalist's number. They weren't close, but she remembered the woman once saying, "If you ever hear of someone being mistreated because they're old, don't hesitate to call me." Well, now she knew someone. That someone was herself. Helen didn't know how this would all end, but she did know one thing: silence only makes betrayal stronger. She no longer hoped Tom or Miranda would change, but she still believed in justice and in truth, the one thing that couldn't be buried under sweet words and quiet cruelty. Inside that small room, Helen pressed save on the recorder, as if marking the beginning of something she could never undo. She knew she was stepping into a new chapter, one where she would no longer be the victim, but a living witness, a voice no one could silence. And this time, she wouldn't wait for someone else to protect her. She would rise for herself. Because sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the very people we once gave everything to. And when that day comes, only the truth, not tears, can make the world listen. Under the soft golden light of an autumn morning, Helen walked slowly down the familiar road that led toward the center of town. Her hand clutched a worn leather handbag, inside of which rested everything she needed: a small USB drive, copies of legal documents, and a notebook filled with her own trembling handwriting, records of conversations, observations, subtle changes that had unfolded over the past few months. Today, she wasn't heading to the market or the bookstore like she usually did. Today, she was going to see a lawyer, the only person she still trusted in a world where even her own family had turned its back on her. The law office was on the second floor of a modest brick building, the same one her late husband, Richard, used to visit every year to review their will or clarify legal questions. The man inside, now seated at the desk, was Jacob Wills, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and calm, steady eyes. When Helen entered, he stood at once, pulling out a chair for her like no time had passed at all. "Helen," he greeted warmly, though his tone held a trace of surprise. "I didn't expect you to come see me alone. What's going on?" Helen sat down, her hands gently folded in her lap like a reflex to steady herself. Then she opened her bag, pulled out the USB, and placed it on the desk. "I need you to watch this," she said slowly, "and tell me what I can do." Jacob plugged the USB into his computer and put on a set of headphones. As the first recordings played, Miranda's cold, calculated voice, his brows furrowed. Then came Tom's voice, casually calling his mother old and confused. After that, the footage video captured by the hidden camera in Helen's living room, showing Tom gently pushing papers toward his mother, assuring her with syrupy lines like, "It's just a formality," while Miranda shot him a knowing glance filled with quiet intent. The evidence wasn't long, but it was crystal clear this was no misunderstanding. This was a plot. When it ended, Jacob removed the headphones and glasses, sitting silently for a few moments as he weighed what he had seen. Helen kept her gaze calm, but inside her heart was waiting, for confirmation, for hope, for justice, for a voice that would affirm what she already knew, that she wasn't crazy and she wasn't alone. At last, Jacob spoke, his words striking the room like a gavel. "Helen, you don't just have evidence, you have a case." He opened a legal pad, jotting down notes as he continued. "We can charge them with elder fraud. That's a felony under Oregon law. Between the recordings, the video, and the documents, this isn't just suspicion. It's organized manipulation. They knew you were lucid. They used your trust against you. They isolated you in your own home. This wasn't confusion. This was calculated." Helen remained quiet. She wasn't happy. She wasn't surprised. What she felt was something like stepping out of the shadows and seeing, however faintly, a road back toward the light. Jacob went on, "If you're willing, I can file with the Office of Elder Protection and notify the local press. A case like this, once made public, can't be buried in silence." She nodded, small, but firm. "I'm willing." Her voice held no rage, no thirst for revenge, just the unwavering strength of someone who had endured enough, and now knew truth was the only weapon she needed. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to sue to reclaim the property?" Helen shook her head. "I'm not fighting for the house. I'm fighting for my dignity. I want the world to know I'm not senile. I'm still aware. And I'm not so easy to fool." That one sentence quieted the entire room. The woman sitting across from Jacob, who once sobbed in this very office after Richard's passing more than a decade ago, had now become something else. A symbol of endurance, of dignity awakened. Jacob gave a solemn nod. "Then I'll stand with you, all the way." Helen smiled, softly, for the first time in months. It wasn't the smile of someone who'd won a battle. It was the smile of someone who had finally reclaimed her voice. A woman who had once been pushed to the sidelines of her own story was now standing in the center, not because of tragedy, but because of courage. As she stepped out of the office and into the pale Oregon sky, Helen tilted her chin up. Tomorrow might be hard. She might face bitterness, cold shoulders, or harsh words from the very people she once called her own. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Because this time she had the truth, she had justice, and more importantly, she had chosen, maybe a little late but perfectly in time, not to surrender but to stand tall. Not to win but to never again bow her head. On a drizzly morning in Oregon, as raindrops tapped softly against the old wooden window frames, Helen Morris sat at the kitchen table, the same table that once echoed with warm family conversations. In front of her lay a thick stack of documents. Her expression was calm, but in her eyes flickered a quiet, unwavering resolve. Today she wasn't just a wounded mother. She was a woman ready to tell her story, openly, publicly, and without apology. After receiving guidance from her attorney, Jacob, Helen spent 3 nights carefully compiling only what mattered most: the audio recordings, the hidden camera footage, suspicious paperwork, and a handwritten journal filled with the quiet documentation of her son and daughter-in-law's behavior. She then sat down and wrote a letter, by hand, plain in tone, but urgent in spirit. It was addressed to the Oregon Sentinel, a small but respected local newspaper she had read for years. It wasn't a national publication, but for Helen, it represented something more important: the voice of the community, a place where injustices still had a chance to be seen. She wasn't begging in the letter. She simply told the truth, clearly, calmly, with the kind of honesty that doesn't seek pity, only recognition. She described what it felt like to be isolated by her own son, to be cornered with legalese disguised as kindness, to be branded as senile, just so her rights could be stripped away. But what made her message truly powerful was how she transitioned from victim to witness. Not a single word of anger, just a quiet warning to society that countless seniors are being manipulated, deceived, and if no one speaks up, this silent abuse will keep happening. The Sentinel's editor, a woman in her 50s named Rebecca, was immediately moved. After listening to the audio and watching the footage, she simply sat in silence. Then she turned to her staff and said, "We cannot stay quiet on this." Within a week, a special investigative feature was drafted, with a bold headline that read, "Local Widow Exposes Property Scheme. They Thought I Was Senile." The story didn't just stir local interest, it exploded online. Larger outlets like Oregon Live and even regional news stations started calling to request interviews. On a Friday evening during the 6 o'clock news, a photo of Helen, silver-haired, clear-eyed, and calmly composed, appeared on screen. Below her image, a headline read, "74-year-old mother secretly records elder fraud and turns the tables." No one had expected a story about a mother being deceived by her own son to resonate so widely. But maybe that's because, beneath it all, was a truth many people recognized: the quiet pain shared by thousands of seniors. Men and women who had spent a lifetime raising their families, only to be pushed aside, labeled as burdens, and in some cases, robbed of their voice and control over their own lives. After the story aired, hundreds of comments poured into the Sentinel's website. One person wrote, "I used to think my mother was just being paranoid until I read this." Another said, "She's so brave. If it were me, I would have just suffered in silence." Social workers and elder care professionals chimed in too, calling for systemic change. "We need to reform how we protect seniors from financial abuse." Helen didn't respond to all the comments. She didn't need praise. But one Sunday morning, while watering her lavender pots on the porch, she saw her neighbor Mrs. Louise walking over with the newspaper in hand. Helen's photo splashed across the front page. Louise didn't say much. She simply took Helen's hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, and whispered, "Thank you. Because of you I told my son no when he asked for my savings." Helen smiled softly. Not because she felt heroic, but because she now understood the truth. When spoken, it spreads, it multiplies, it becomes a light stronger than silence. She had once been dismissed as confused. But now, her voice had become a bell that rang loud enough to wake a society far too used to underestimating its elders. Tom and Miranda had no idea how far the story had traveled, but Helen no longer cared what they thought or planned. What mattered now was that she was no longer trapped in the shadows. And if a 74-year-old mother could unravel a scheme others had carefully designed, then anyone could, as long as they had the courage to say, "I will not be silent anymore." On a gloomy Monday morning in Lane County, Oregon, the local courthouse was unusually crowded. The wooden benches of the small courtroom were filled with reporters, curious citizens, and quiet social workers there to observe. On the judge's bench sat a red-marked file labeled Helen Morris vs. Tom and Miranda Morris, the red tag signifying a case involving suspected elder abuse. Helen sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a slate gray coat buttoned up to her collar. Her face showed no obvious emotion, but her eyes held something deeper, resolve. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet clarity that comes after living through profound loss. Next to her sat her attorney Jacob Wills, a man she once thought of only as her late husband's old friend, now standing firmly by her side in a fight for dignity. The courtroom door opened. Tom and Miranda stepped inside. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, their faces looked more pale than usual. Miranda kept her eyes down as she passed the first row. Tom, the man who once urged his mother to just sign for convenience, now stared at his leather shoes, avoiding every glance cast his way. They didn't sit close together, and when the judge entered, both of them flinched slightly, as if standing before the jury of their lives, not just a legal court. The hearing began with the steady voice of the judge. "This case concerns suspected elder financial abuse, filed by Mrs. Helen Morris, age 74. One by one, the attorneys presented their cases. Helen's lawyer submitted a USB drive containing audio recordings, edited video clips, and original documents Helen had pulled from the family printer. On the judge's monitor appeared footage from the hidden camera. Tom and Miranda sitting in their home office. "She won't know what she's signing. We'll sell the house and move to Arizona." Miranda's voice rang out, sharp, calculated. Tom nodded in the video, casually patting his wife's shoulder. "She's old. She's slipping. No one will believe her anyway." The courtroom fell silent. Murmurs rippled across the back row. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras zoomed in on the defendants. Miranda refused to look up. Tom buried his face in a trembling hand. No verdict had been announced yet, but the truth could no longer be denied. Tom and Miranda's defense tried to downplay the situation. They claimed Helen had misunderstood, that the recordings were private family conversations, that they had only been trying to help her organize her estate. But when the judge asked, why was she never informed about the ownership transfer? Why was the deed printed before she was consulted? There was no answer. After nearly 3 hours of testimony and cross-examination, the judge delivered the verdict. His voice was calm, but every word landed with weight. After reviewing the evidence, including audio, video, and sworn statements, this court finds the deed submitted to Mrs. Morris was invalid, and the process by which it was presented involved manipulation and exploitation of an elderly individual. All documents related to the attempted transfer of the property at 11 Maple Avenue are hereby nullified. He paused, then looked directly at Tom and Miranda. The matter will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for further investigation under Oregon Revised Statute 165.125. Should additional evidence support prosecution, criminal charges for elder fraud may follow. No one clapped, there were no cheers. But in Helen's eyes, for the first time in many months, a light returned. It wasn't the glow of victory. It was the quiet warmth of healing. She didn't want her son in prison. What she wanted, what she fought for, was something more enduring: the right to be heard, to be seen, to be respected. After the hearing ended, Helen rose from her seat. She walked slowly past Tom. Her son avoided her gaze. She didn't demand an apology. She no longer expected one. She simply looked at him and said, in a voice just above a whisper, "You thought I was losing my mind. But I remember everything." Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom, small in frame but unshakably upright, leaving behind not just a verdict, but a message that didn't belong to her alone, but to millions of older Americans fighting against isolation, betrayal, and invisibility. And at least for today, one of them had been heard. Under the soft, yellow glow of the ceiling light, Helen's kitchen had never felt so quiet. There was no sound of coffee dripping, no doors creaking open like in the mornings when her son was still young. No one wandered in asking, "What's for breakfast, Mom?" or bumped her shoulder in a rush. The house had settled back into its original rhythm, the rhythm of a widow's life of solitude. But now, it was also the rhythm of a woman who had reclaimed her dignity. The wooden table in the center of the dining room was no longer cluttered with legal papers, nor fitted with hidden cameras. Helen was removing them, one by one. Her hands trembled slightly but moved with purpose. She wiped off the dust, coiled the cords carefully, and placed each device into an old tin box with faded green floral designs. It had once held cookies, a gift from her late husband, Helen Morris, after a long deployment nearly 30 years ago. Now it held something more valuable, the truth. Beside the box lay her pocket voice recorder, the very one that had captured whispered betrayals and plans they thought would never be discovered. Helen picked it up and held it gently to her chest, a silent gesture of gratitude, not toward the machine but toward herself, for not screaming in pain, for not losing control when her own son turned against her, for not falling apart when they dismissed her as just a senile old woman. She rose and walked slowly to the hallway mirror. The glass had dulled over the years, the wooden frame chipped and worn, but the reflection was clear. Each line on her face, each trace of time, was right there. Helen stared at herself, not to admire but to recognize, to fully acknowledge the woman who had just fought a battle without armor, without weapons, and still stood. She whispered to her reflection, her voice barely louder than the wind slipping through the cracks of the old house. "You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need the truth." A few months ago, those words might have made Helen laugh. Back then, truth had felt like a distant concept, something people often avoided when it was too painful to face. But now she knew, the truth, when protected and revealed at the right time, becomes the most powerful voice in the room. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to exist, quiet, steady, and unwavering. Helen didn't feel triumphant. Not like the characters in the movies when they win their final battle. There was no sweeping music in her mind, no tears of joy, just an unfamiliar stillness. She understood that this victory wouldn't bring back family bonds. Tom and Miranda, her son and daughter-in-law, might never come back. No apology would be written, no phone call would come, and she had made peace with that. Because real victory doesn't lie in punishing someone. It lies in not losing yourself, in not being reshaped by doubt, in not drowning in rage. Helen had held on to the most precious thing of all, her belief in fairness, and her ability to speak out when it mattered most. She stepped out onto the porch. The March breeze in Oregon was cool, carrying the last chill of winter, but it felt gentle, like a quiet farewell. Helen lowered herself into the old rocking chair, running her fingers along the worn wooden armrest. This house had nearly been stolen from her, not by strangers but by the very boy she once held in her arms, once sang lullabies to, once believed would protect her in her old age. That was the cruelest truth, but also the source of her liberation. Helen no longer dreamed of warm, crowded family dinners, but she dreamed of mornings like this, quiet, safe, free. She could breathe again. No one was manipulating her, no one was questioning her mind. She was living once more as an independent woman, older, slower, perhaps, but never stronger. Tomorrow, Helen would walk to the local community center to begin a memoir writing class, something she had always wanted to do but never found the courage for. She would write her story, not for attention, not for praise, but so that others like her, seniors who had been betrayed, neglected, dismissed, would know they weren't alone, that their voices mattered, that justice didn't expire with age, and truth never goes out of style. And if someone were to ask her now, after all of this, what the greatest lesson was, Helen would smile, place a hand over her heart, and say, when there's no one left to trust, trust yourself, because when you protect the truth, you protect your worth. Beneath the pale blue skies of a spring morning, Helen stood inside a modest community center hall in Eugene, Oregon. Before her sat nearly 100 people, most with silver hair, weathered faces, and quiet, searching eyes. But their gazes weren't filled with curiosity. They were filled with something deeper, recognition. It was as if everyone in that room had come searching for a reflection of their own untold story in the one they were about to hear. The seminar was titled, The Right to Be Heard When Aging Doesn't Mean Silence. Helen wasn't invited to speak as a victim. She was there as a survivor, a symbol of awareness, of strength forged in quiet defiance, and of a voice that never ages when it's rooted in truth. When the program host called her name, the audience erupted in applause. Not because she was famous, not because she was a social media icon or a politician, but because she stood for hundreds, maybe thousands of older adults who had been overlooked, dismissed, or even exploited, often by the very families they raised. Helen stepped up to the podium, clutching the marked-up pages of her speech, written in the neat, slanted handwriting of someone who'd spent a lifetime putting pen to paper. She took a deep breath to steady her voice and then smiled gently. Good morning, she began. My name is Helen Morris. I'm 74 years old. I'm a widow. I worked as a librarian. And I'm the mother of a son I once believed would never hurt me. The room fell utterly still. I'm not here to tell a sob story. I'm here to tell the truth. My son and daughter-in-law tried to quietly transfer the ownership of the home my late husband and I spent 40 years building together. They asked me to sign a few documents. They called it a simple legal restructure. They assumed I was too old to notice. They thought senile would be the perfect excuse to disguise betrayal. She paused, letting the silence settle over the room where many eyes had already begun to glisten. But I didn't sign, and I didn't scream or throw things or tear up the papers. I did the one thing I knew would make a difference. I recorded the truth, cameras, voice recorders, evidence. I didn't need to shout to be believed. I just needed to hold on to my memory, my resolve, and my self-respect. The applause came again, louder this time, filled with genuine admiration. Helen continued, her voice calm but unwavering. Don't let people use the word old to erase your worth. Don't let the word senile be the reason they strip you of ownership, of autonomy, of your right to live with agency. Wisdom doesn't live in your birth certificate. It lives in your decision to protect it until the very end. For a moment, no one in the room moved. Her words hung in the air like something sacred. People love to say respect your elders, she added, but real respect only comes when older people stand up and say, I'm still here. I'm still sharp. And I still have rights. She closed her speech with a line that brought the entire room to its feet. Don't let the word senile silence you. Let it be the reason you rise and prove that growing old is not the end, it's a new chapter, and you still have the pen. After that day, Helen's story became more than just a legal victory. It became the spark for a quiet movement across Oregon's aging community. Truth has no age. Small groups began forming where seniors learned how to protect their assets, how to read legal documents, and most importantly, how to say no when something didn't feel right. They started listening to themselves more and relying less on blind obedience to their children. And Helen, with her slender frame, steady voice, and deeply lived eyes, became a symbol. Not a symbol of victimhood, but of defiance, of wisdom that refused to wither, of an aging woman who was never weak, only quiet when necessary, and unshakably clear when it mattered most. After everything she had endured, from the betrayal by her own son, to the nights spent quietly listening to voice recordings that cut deeper than any blade, to the courage it took to bring the truth into the light, Helen Morris understood one thing with painful clarity: her story couldn't simply end as another legal case filed and closed in a courtroom. No, She knew too well that behind countless closed doors in countless homes, there were still others like her. Elders suffering in silence, pushed aside, made to feel invisible, simply because they weren't speaking up, and others assumed they were no longer clear-minded enough to be heard. So Helen wrote. In her small apartment, where morning light spilled across the wooden floor, she sat at her writing desk. Her hands turned over blank pages and her pen moved slowly, deliberately, like she was stitching closed the torn edges of her life, one word at a time. Her memoir was title signed, not silenced. A Widow's Stand Against Greed. A title sharp enough to provoke curiosity, and honest enough to reach into the hearts of those who've lived through similar wounds. In every chapter, Helen told her truth not as a legal timeline, but as a deeply human experience. She wrote about what it feels like to be underestimated, to be seen as disposable just because of her age. She wrote about sleepless nights, about the moment she heard her own son say, "She's old. She won't even notice." And she wrote about how she pulled herself back up not out of bitterness, but from a belief that the truth was worth protecting. That dignity doesn't fade with age. It only disappears when we surrender our voice. On the final page of the book, Helen left a message, words she had once whispered to herself in the mirror when she felt utterly alone. When your voice trembles, record it. When no one believes you, prove it. And when your heart breaks, rebuild it. Every crack will be proof that you lived, you fought, and you didn't give up. The memoir quickly began circulating through senior communities. It became a quiet force of inspiration for those who had grown used to living in the shadows. Helen never imagined herself as a symbol. She only hoped that someone, somewhere, might read her words and feel just a little less alone. And if that happened, then every painful moment was worth it. From being labeled senile, Helen stepped into the light as a voice the world needed to hear. A quiet reminder that age doesn't silence a person, only surrender does. Thank you for staying with Sarah's stories all the way to the end of this powerful journey. If Helen's story touched something in you even just a little, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share raw, moving, and deeply human stories that matter. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to wake up an entire generation.